The ongoing conflict in Sudan has escalated into what is now being described as one of the most severe humanitarian crises in the world. The violence, which began as a political and military struggle between various factions within the Sudanese government and opposition forces, has now reached catastrophic levels. Thousands of civilians have lost their lives and millions have been displaced from their homes, leaving the country in a state of devastation. The situation has grown increasingly dire, particularly in the Darfur region and in towns like El Fasher, where reports of widespread atrocities against civilians have emerged. Massad Boulos, US Special Envoy for African Affairs, addressed the situation in a statement released from Doha, Qatar, on the 15th of November 2025. In his comments, Boulos made a stark assessment of the scale of the crisis, calling the war in Sudan the world's largest humanitarian crisis today. The humanitarian aspect of this conflict is the world's largest humanitarian catastrophe, Boulos said, reflecting on the devastating toll the conflict is taking on Sudan's civilian population. The US Envoy stressed that the situation is not just one of political instability, but a severe humanitarian emergency. Particularly what has happened in El Fasher in the last 2 or 3 weeks, he continued, pointing to the violence that has intensified in the northern region of Sudan. El Fasher, a city in the Darfur region, has been one of the focal points of the fighting, and the situation there has become a symbol of the broader crisis facing Sudan. According to reports, thousands of civilians have been caught in the crossfire, with many killed or injured in airstrikes, ground fighting and targeted assaults by armed groups. The violence has disrupted basic services such as healthcare and access to food, and has exacerbated the suffering of those trapped in the conflict zone. Boulos's comments reflect the widespread international concern over the situation. The United Nations and numerous humanitarian organizations have issued urgent appeals for aid and intervention, but access to those in need remains severely restricted due to ongoing hostilities. Aid convoys are unable to reach many parts of the country, and refugees who have fled the violence are often left without adequate shelter or food. Massad Boulos's remarks underscored the depth of the crisis. We have all seen those videos, we have seen those reports. Those atrocities are absolutely unacceptable, he stated, referencing the numerous graphic reports and video footage emerging from Sudan that have shocked the international community. These disturbing images have raised awareness about the scale of the violence and the human suffering occurring on the ground. The international community has responded with condemnation and calls for accountability, but tangible action has been limited. The US government under President Donald Trump has pledged to support diplomatic efforts to bring about an end to the conflict and address the humanitarian crisis. The US has expressed its willingness to assist in peace talks, and Boulos emphasized that the United States remains committed to facilitating a peaceful resolution to the war. However, with no sign of a ceasefire in sight, diplomatic efforts have yet to yield significant results. The humanitarian situation in Sudan is compounded by the country's fragile infrastructure, which has been further deteriorated by years of conflict. The government's ability to provide basic services, including medical care and humanitarian assistance, has been severely weakened. In the absence of effective governance and in the face of escalating violence, aid organizations have been forced to find alternative ways to assist those in need. Many displaced Sudanese people have sought refuge in neighboring countries, but these countries are also struggling to accommodate the influx of refugees. The strain on regional resources has been immense, with countries such as Chad and South Sudan bearing the brunt of the refugee crisis. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has called for greater international support for the countries hosting Sudanese refugees as they face mounting challenges in providing food, shelter and medical care. In Sudan itself, the war has displaced over 3 million people, many of whom have sought shelter in makeshift camps or in the homes of relatives. These displaced populations are facing extreme conditions with inadequate access to clean water, food and healthcare. According to the World Health Organization, the lack of medical supplies and the ongoing violence have led to widespread disease outbreaks, further exacerbating the suffering of civilians. El Fasher, along with other cities in Darfur and South Kordofan, has been a central battleground in the conflict. For weeks, heavy fighting between government forces and rebel groups has intensified, resulting in mass casualties and widespread destruction. The humanitarian situation in these regions has deteriorated to the point where many are living in fear of being caught in the crossfire. For those remaining in these war-torn regions, survival has become a daily struggle. The international community has been closely monitoring the situation, but efforts to intervene have been hindered by the complexity of the conflict and the political dynamics at play. While the UN Security Council has condemned the violence and several countries have imposed sanctions on the Sudanese government, progress towards a diplomatic solution has been slow. The Sudanese government, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, has been resistant to international intervention, and the various armed groups involved in the conflict have been unwilling to negotiate peace on terms that would bring an end to the violence. Massad Boulos, in his remarks, also acknowledged the challenges of reaching a peaceful resolution. Despite these difficulties, he emphasized the importance of continued diplomatic efforts. This must stop very quickly, Boulos said, highlighting the urgent need for an end to the violence. He called on all parties involved to prioritize humanitarian access and cease the attacks on civilians. The US government has stated that it will continue to work with international partners to support peace initiatives and to pressure all sides in the conflict to de-escalate and engage in negotiations. While diplomacy remains the primary focus, the scale of the humanitarian crisis has led to a growing call for increased international intervention. The UN and various non-governmental organisations have appealed for greater resources and support to address the needs of the displaced and affected populations. But with the conflict still raging, many fear that the situation will continue to deteriorate unless a concerted and immediate international effort is made to intervene. As the war in Sudan continues, the civilian population bears the brunt of the violence, with entire communities being uprooted and tens of thousands of people fleeing their homes in search of safety. With no end in sight, the humanitarian disaster continues to unfold, and the international community faces increasing pressure to take more decisive action. In conclusion, the war in Sudan stands as one of the most severe humanitarian crises of our time. The United States, through the efforts of Special Envoy Massad Boulos, is urging the international community to come together to bring an end to the violence and address the needs of those suffering in Sudan. While diplomatic efforts continue, the situation remains dire, and the world watches as the crisis unfolds, with millions of lives at risk. As the conflict in Sudan persists, the urgency for international intervention grows, with calls for immediate action to halt the violence and prevent further loss of life. While diplomatic channels remain open, the continued humanitarian suffering demands a more robust and coordinated global response. The world now faces a critical moment in addressing one of the most devastating crises of the 21st century, where swift and decisive action is necessary to protect civilian lives and restore stability to the region.
The conflict in Sudan, the humanitarian side of this conflict is the world's biggest humanitarian crisis today, and the world's biggest humanitarian catastrophe. Especially what happened in El Fasher in the last 2 or 3 weeks. We've all seen those videos, we've seen those reports. Those atrocities are absolutely unacceptable. This must stop.